you know, when I think of this term pink tide, as you were speaking, Ben, I think of the term pinko back in the Communist Party days, right? Like the pinkos were they were not red, but they were not blue or white or whatever. You know, they weren't they weren't supposedly anti-communist. They kind of hung around the Communist Party, but they did not support socialism, the socialist bloc. They also were more than willing to abandon the Communist Party when things got tough. And so it can have this insinuation, I think, that the left in Latin America, especially, as you said, the most revolutionary edge of it, those forces who are leading, those nations that are leading this charge, that they somehow represent this kind of different form of socialism that isn't as militant, maybe, isn't as radical, isn't as visionary as those dredges, those dark ages of the 20th century Cold War, of the socialist bloc, and of now modern China, which has, of course, gained this incredibly unfortunate reputation in the West and in the US in particular as this quote unquote authoritarian, colonialist, imperialist, dictatorial power, right? I think that there is this attempt, even just in the minds, and it could be just subconscious. It could be we just have too many people affected by the anti-communism of the Cold War, but it does remind me of that. And you know, I want to pivot though to this idea of multipolarity, and also we're seeing multipolarity kind of really take shape here in this Ukraine-Russia conflict that we, of course, have to always comment on because everybody's talking about it, and we do have to talk about this. So I think that multipolarity is such an important just issue, just a development to talk about. I know, Ben, you are really dedicated to this with your new publication, Multipolarista, really covering this development very concretely. And of course, we have Friends of Socialist China here at the Left Lens. We see it as such a positive development. So, you know, I guess both of you to comment, maybe Carlos, you can go first. What are the prospects here and how does it relate to this Ukraine-Russia conflict? Because there's a lot of propaganda going on right now, and Russia is at the forefront of this multipolar world. But now that it is on this offensive, there is this huge compulsion, right? Because the entire weight of the Western imperialist establishment is saying, okay, now Russia's doing this really bad thing. So now if you weren't on the anti-Russia bandwagon before, get on it. And a lot of people, you know, we talk about this all the time off the record, just how many people we've seen just anti-imperialist leftists just say, okay, yeah, we'll jump on that bandwagon. And that seems quite comfortable now that there is this military offensive going on. So yeah, let's shift this conversation a bit. Multipolarity, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how do they relate? And in particular, Carlos, if you would comment, because you do a lot of work on the Soviet Union, how did the collapse of the Soviet Union really influence this era we're in right now? I know I gave you the most difficult
question. Handing me two enormous questions. I'll do what I can. You know, I mean, this multipolarity is a really crucial issue, and really, it's kind of, I think it comes down to the key geopolitical dynamic of our era that we're living through, and it's worth trying to be clear what multipolarity means. Jenny Clegg, who's a China scholar and who's someone, you know, she also works with us in Friends of Socialist China. She's on our advisory board. She's defined it as a pattern of multiple centers of power, all with a certain capacity to influence world affairs, shaping a negotiated order. So instead of our actually existing reality of unipolarity and hegemony, which is really since 1945 to some degree, when there was you know, there were two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US, but the US continued to be by far the strongest and the most economically dominant, and the most active in terms of projecting its power around the world. And then since 1991, you know, we've lived in a unipolar world where the US has been the one superpower, and on that basis, through being economically, financially through dollar hegemony, militarily through NATO and through 800 overseas military bases, and through, you know, its outsized, you know, absurdly outsized military budget and its domination of nuclear weaponry. It's been able to aggressively pursue and consolidate and maintain its hegemony. So multipolarity represents stepping away from that, stepping away from unipolarity to a more balanced, a more equitable, a more democratic system of international relations, where you have a number of different powers, you know, countries, regional groupings. You know, the US is almost certainly going to continue to be a relatively strong pole for the foreseeable future. But the same is the case for Russia, the same is the case for China, the same is the case for the EU, the same is the case for Latin America and the Caribbean, the same is the case for the Arab world and for the African Union. And through this more democratic and more equal system, there's an opportunity for a more peaceful world. And very importantly, Samir Amin conceptualized multipolarity as a crucial kind of springboard to socialism. Because once you've got a multipolar system, as a developing country, as an independent sovereign country trying to figure out your path to development and to a prosperous future, you don't have to submit yourself to the US. You don't have to submit yourself to the Bretton Woods institutions, to international finance and dollar hegemony. You don't have to submit yourself to privatization and deregulation and the Washington consensus. You've got choices, which means that you can develop along the, you know, the lines that suit your conditions and that match the demands of your people and the needs of your people. So in that sense, multipolarity creates an opportunity for humanity to get on the path towards socialism, where imperialism and unipolarity and US unilateralism has prevented that. Now, that's great, but it's kind of the US is instinctively responding to this trajectory, which is the basic and inexorable trajectory of international relations. The US instinctively responds to that with what we're seeing now is the new Cold War, which is directed primarily against China, but is also directed against Russia. It's also directed against Iran. It's also directed against sovereign Africa. It's also directed against sovereign Latin America. It's a global phenomenon, and you can see, you know, it's developing a whole military infrastructure which is global. You know, the core is NATO, which is kind of, you know, it's been pulled over from the original Cold War into the new Cold War. That's now been joined by AUKUS, which was Joe Biden's first foreign policy initiative, actually, is this military nuclear alliance between the US, Australia, and Britain. The Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, then these US military bases, the THAAD missile defense systems, the updated nuclear weapons systems, the RIMPAC military exercises. You've got a increasingly comprehensive military infrastructure related to the new Cold War, which is about containing and suppressing China and Russia. And I think the Ukraine crisis very clearly fits into this paradigm. You know, there's a huge amount of confusion, including on the left and the West, about what's the basic character of this Ukraine crisis. And a lot of people, including progressive people, think that it's an example of inter-imperialist rivalry. The US is the dominant imperialist power, Russia is a rising imperialist power or an aspirational imperialist power, and they're fighting it out for control of Eastern Europe, which, you know, Ben's talked about this before, Danny, you've talked about this before, but it's a fundamental mischaracterization. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, imperialism isn't a foreign policy choice. It's not that Russia, if it wanted to, could just, you know, one day say, do you know what, capitalism's okay, but why don't we just be imperialists? That'd be cool. You know, we'd be doing even better. Like, that's not an option. Russia in 1991, upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, had hoped that it would be incorporated into the imperialist world system. That was the plan. That was the idea. You know, the US had different ideas. You know, as far as the US was concerned, okay, you know, we've got rid of the Soviet Union. That was our number one concern. we're willing to bring you in on the ground level, but there's maybe a cleaning job going. You're not coming onto the board of directors. So as long as you're willing to be in a subservient position under our domination, then yes, you can be in an imperialist world system, but you're not going to be an equal player. So Russia has essentially felt betrayed, and increasingly had to focus east to form alliances that could counter US hegemonies, just so that Russia could pursue an independent path. And over the last 10, 20 years in particular, as Ben has been documenting very effectively in his articles recently, Russia and China have been getting very close together. Russia has excellent relations with Iran. Russia has excellent relations with Turkey. Russia has excellent relations with India. Russia has excellent relations with Latin America. It's no coincidence that countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia have come out very clearly in favor of the Russian position, because they consider Russia rightly as a key ally. So Russia is one of the linchpins of this rising multipolarity, and that's why it's in the sights of US imperialism. That's why there's this basic contradiction. That's why NATO is expanding. There's no need for NATO. What is the need for NATO post-1991, post the collapse of the Soviet Union? Why does NATO exist? NATO has been used consistently, expanding into 14 states of Eastern Europe and coming right up to Russia's border, specifically in order to contain and suppress and threaten Russia and to assert and maintain US hegemony. It's unsurprising that Russia's not going to be happy with that situation permanently. So, that's the basic character, and it's super important that people understand that it's not about inter-imperialist rivalry. It's not about Russia deciding as a matter of policy that it wants to be an imperialist power, because that's not how power works. That's not how imperialism works.
Yeah, Ben, jump right in.
Yeah, I know you guys are part of this excellent group, the International Manifesto Group, and I think you all spelled out very well in the manifesto. I think it's called Through Pluripolarity to Socialism, right? And I think people can check that out at internationalmanifesto.org, right? And let me see, I think I have it up here. It's internationalmanifesto.org, yeah. So I mean, I think that manifesto spells it out very clearly, but for people who don't want to read it, I mean, just in brief, there are critiques of the idea of multipolarity, because multipolarity, it's true, doesn't mean the end of imperialism. So and you can actually have a multipolar system with multiple imperialism. This is a critique that I've heard, recently from comrades who I very much respect and agree with on many things. Brian Becker has articulated a very fair criticism. But I think the point of understanding multipolarity, I think there's 2 points to make. One, multipolarity is an objective observation of the global system that we're in right now. I mean, it's not even a matter of wanting the world to be multipolar. It is multipolar. And Russia's intervention in Ukraine is a reflection of that fact. And then two, the point, as the manifesto argues, and I think it's the correct analysis, is that the point is that multipolarity or pluripolarity, which are very similar concepts, we can basically use them interchangeably. The point is that that process of global transformation is what will help facilitate the move towards socialism, because we've seen the disaster of the US unipolar order. Under US hegemony, any people around the world that tried to implement a socialist model could be crushed, could be strangled economically. The US would organize a coup. The US would invade the country, as it did to Grenada, as it did to Panama. I mean, Panama wasn't necessarily a good political model, but it was an independent model. But Grenada is a great example of that, where you had a revolutionary movement, a socialist revolution, and then the US literally just invades and overthrows the government. In Libya was the most prosperous country in Africa, with a unique model of resource nationalism and providing very substantial, support for the people in housing programs and education and healthcare. And in the context of the region, it also had a very progressive government that was a friend of national liberation struggles around the world. And that government was destroyed by NATO, by imperialism. And 11 years later, there's still no central government in Libya. So that's unipolarity. You can't develop socialism in a unipolar world, because it will be crushed, it will be destroyed. And I think what's interesting is understanding the contradictions of the multipolar system that we're in. Because again, it's not even a matter of wanting the world to be multipolar. It objectively is. increasingly multipolar, and understanding that there are good elements of that, of course. The fact that you have China, which is a socialist government and has become increasingly influential and has taken a more, I don't want to say interventionist foreign policy, because its foreign policy is still very much anti-interventionist, but whereas in the 1990s and 2000s, the Chinese motto was to lie low and bide time, to maintain a low profile and bide time. Now China has been taken more of a leadership role, but again, not in a unilateral way, but in a bilateral way and a multilateral way, in a way that is advantageous to other countries, that is mutually beneficial for other countries. So that is a positive example of multipolarity opening space for countries like Venezuela, which, you know, U.S. unipolarity, we see that policy toward Cuba for the past 60 years of a crushing, illegal, suffocating blockade that has resulted in who knows how many deaths of Cubans, that has resulted in trillions of dollars of wealth being stolen from the country by this blockade, that has resulted in suffering for the people of Cuba for decades. Whereas now, China has been able to help Cuba throughout this process. And in Venezuela, we see that the U.S. imposes blockade on Venezuela illegally, a criminal blockade that has also resulted in tens of thousands of Venezuelan deaths. And one of the main reasons, I think we have to be honest about this. I mean, I've been to Venezuela multiple times. I know the country decently well. And I know a lot of Venezuelans, and I've talked to many Venezuelans. And there is a lot of support for the Chavista movement. It is very much a popular movement. It is a working class movement. The base of Chavismo and the Bolivarian Revolution is in the poor barrios. But being realistic, I will admit that if it were not for the support of China and also Russia throughout these very difficult past few years of a U.S. blockade, brutal sanctions, constant hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, attempted invasions, terror attacks, all of these, if it were not for the support of China and Russia, I think the government probably would have fallen in Venezuela. So the fact that the world is multipolar shows that it does provide the space for socialist movements to breathe and to continue to move forward. Whereas in a unipolar system dominated by the U.S. empire, that is not the case. Now, there have been critiques made by comrades I respect, and it's true that I think Turkey is an example of a country that represents the limitations of multipolarity. Turkey is an aspiring imperialist power. It's a member of NATO, the imperialist cartel. It helped the imperialist bloc try to destroy the post-colonial country of Syria, the post-colonial government of Syria, a nationalist government that is a friend of Global South movements. Turkey has also helped Azerbaijan wage war on Armenia. Turkey has sent drones to Ukraine to use those drones against the people of the Donbass region in the east. So, I mean, Turkey is also a friend of Russia to an extent. I mean, they have a frenemy relationship. Turkey has also, ironically, has helped Venezuela as well. So that's multipolarity, right? There are positive elements that can help socialist movements grow and have room to breathe. But then there's a recognition that there are these reactionary powers, like, you know, Erdogan is not a progressive leader, and he has his own national interests. And in some ways that can challenge U.S. unipolarity and hegemony. But in some ways, when it's in the interest of Turkey, at least according to this kind of crude, narrow understanding of Turkish national interests, he will ally with imperialism. So again, those are the 2 points I wanted to make, that multipolarity represents an opportunity to move towards socialism, as I think the International Manifesto Group correctly argues. And then also the other point, again, is that regardless of whether or not we want multipolarity, it's here. And with my website, Multipolarista, I mean, it's a recognition as a journalist. It's also just about documenting that process, understanding that process, because whether or not people want it, it's a reality.